Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma daf lamed bet. There's a study guide. If you can put it up in the chat if it's not there yet. Everyone should use it. It's very helpful we have a lot of different sugyot going on today. We're going to learn a whole bunch of different mishnayot. So we're going to jump from topic to topic, and the chart will help organize things. So we're going to start with our Mishna, just a quick review. I don't want to read it from the beginning because we have a long daf, but we had two people walking, one with a barrel or a jug and the other with a beam. And the beam knocks into the barrel and breaks it. And then we had different scenarios. We talked about if they're both walking side by side or opposite each other, then everyone has permission to be there and everyone should have noticed, and therefore the person holding the beam is not responsible. However, and likewise, they're not responsible if the person with the beam is in the front, because the person in the back should have noticed and shouldn't have gotten too close. But then we said, if all of a sudden, unexpectedly, they stop, right? The person with the beam stops, then of course they're responsible unless they warned. Okay, and that was a whole thing we talked about yesterday about the expectation about warning. Now we get to the second case, second line of our daf today. Haya bal chavit rishon ubal korah acharon. What if it was the reverse? And the person with the barrel was in front and the person with the beam was in the back. Then everything is going to be flipped. Nishbera chavit bakorah. If the person in the back jams into the barrel in the front, obviously they're going to be chayav. Ve'imamad bal chavit patur. But if the person holding the barrel stopped, they would be exempt because it was their fault for stopping. And now, again, who would be exempt? The person with the beam. It's always the person with the beam that's going to be liable because the beam didn't break. It's the barrel that broke. But if the person with the barrel stopped, then of course it's the responsibility of the person carrying the beam, carrying the barrel who stopped, which means that they're not going to get paid damages. But if the person holding the barrel in the front said, I'm going to stop for a minute, please stop, and the person with the beam just kept walking, obviously then they're going to be liable. Same thing if one person is holding, it's hard to say candle. It's not really a candle. They talk about when they say a ner in those days, by the way, is really one of those, they had like an earthenware vessel where they would fill it with oil and they would light a candle from it. You see these in ancient, all types of, kids in Israel always make them in Gan. So that's where I always have the image from. But if one is holding a light like that and the other one is holding flax, it would be the exact same thing. Again, where one could be damaged by the others, right? The candle could damage the flax. So the candle is like the one carrying the beam, and the pishtan is the one who's like the barrel, and then all the details would be the same. Now we're going to ask in the Gemara, Natan is going to ask Rav Huna an interesting question that you wouldn't have thought would be connected to this. And in the end, maybe we'll see it's not exactly connected to this, but we're going to have a lot of associations today with other things that each time we associate something, it's not going to be so clear that it was a valid connection. So Rabba bar Natan asked Rav Huna, Ba'amine Rabba bar Natan me Rav Huna, Hamazika dishto b'tashmisha mitamahu. If while engaging in sexual relations, the husband injures the wife. Okay, this is hard to read in light of events of October 7th. There it was obviously totally different. But in general, we're going to talk about all sorts of relevant issues. But here we have a husband and wife who are engaging in sexual relations, not in the case of, let's say, a horrible, terrible rape. But here we have a permitted relationship. Everything's fine. And somehow he injures her while they're having sexual relations together. So do we say, since he was allowed to have relations with her, he's exempt from any damage he might cause her? Now, this is something we keep going back to. Or maybe he should be paying attention to what he's doing. Well, we're going to have two answers to this question, opposite answers. And then I'm going to show you how we paskin, because I think it's just interesting, and I even brought it on the study guide. Amarle Tanitua. So the first answer Rav Huna gives him is Rav Huna, who was asked the question, and he says, we can learn it from our Mishna. What does it say in our Mishna? In the beginning of our Mishna, it said, before we got into all the complicated cases, if the two people are walking side by side and they bump into each other and injure each other, no one's responsible for damages. Why, right? Or one damages the others. They're not responsible. Why is that? Just like they each have permission to be walking on the street. And therefore, if they accidentally bumped into each other, it's nobody's fault more than the other. Well, the whole issue is that they had permission to be there. So he had permission to be with his wife. And therefore, since he was permitted to be with her, any damage caused, he's not responsible for. To which Rava says, what are you talking about? I'm a Rava, kal v'chomer. It's a simple kal v'chomer argument. And interestingly enough, he brings it from a case of rotzeach b'shgaga. Okay, this is unfortunately very relevant. Case of Yuval Kastelman, who was unfortunately killed accidentally in the pigua the other day, where somebody shot him thinking that he was the terrorist. It was a classic case of, well, that's the question. And today we're going to talk a lot about accidental murder. What is a classic case of accidental murder, right? We're going to see there's a big range. There's shgaga, which is in the middle, where an accidental murder, according to halacha, goes to an ir refuge city, which, if you remember, we've learned this before, it has two elements to it. Number one, it's a punishment because you killed someone accidentally and you should be punished for it. Number two, punishments always provide atonement, right? And in this case, it not only provides atonement, it also provides protection from the relatives, right? There's a whole course of 4 sessions on this on our site, on the course's website, because it's a fascinating topic about when you get to go to Ir Miklat, when you don't. And we're going to talk about some of these sugyot today. But right now, we're just going to look at a very basic. Okay, we're going to say the following. The classic case in the Torah that discusses it is 2 people are in a forest, and one is chopping down trees, and a piece of the axe flies off and kills somebody. That's the classic case of accidental murder in the Torah. So comes Rava and he says, we can make a kal v'chomer from there. Ma ya'ar shezeh l'reshuto nichnas v'zeh l'reshuto nichnas. In a ya'ar, both had permission to be there. Now, according to what you said, if both have permission to be there, then no one's responsible. But what happens here? In a ya'ar, it was a public forest, obviously, and yet, na'asa k'misha nichnas l'reshut chavero v'chayav. The one who killed is viewed as if he went into someone else's property and killed there. And that's even though he had permission to be in the forest, we still hold this person accountable for their actions. So now here they do a little bit of a play. Now, it's true they both had permission to be there, but this man went into the domain of someone else, literally, or right, actually went inside the woman. Lo koshaken, that he should be liable for damages. Now, I want to just point out that both these comparisons are not fair comparisons. Why? We're comparing apples and oranges in both cases, okay? In the case of damages of the chavit and the korah, we're comparing damages of damage to your vessel to damage to a person. That's not the same thing. Here, we're comparing damage to a person, in the second comparison, to rotzeach b'shgaga, which is death. Death is not the same as causing damages, and when you go to Ir Miklat, has its own unique rules about when you go and when you don't go, which we're going to talk a lot about today later in the daf. We're actually going to get to this from a totally different connection later. And therefore, both comparisons are not really exactly fair comparisons. But I guess each one didn't really have any other means of comparison, so they each chose this. So now they say, okay, so you want to say, Rava, that it's a kal v'chomer from the Yah. And from there, you get that the man is actually liable for damages he causes to his wife while they're engaging in sexual relations. Well, what do you do with our Mishnah then? What, you're going to ignore our Mishnah? To which he said, Hatam travayu ka'adadinin. Hacha I ka'avid masa. It's not really a fair comparison to the Mishnah. Because the Mishnah, what happened? One was walking, the other was walking. They both bump into each other. They're both doing an action. They're both walking. And in walking, they bump into each other. In the case of sexual relations, only the man is doing an action. This is a whole big question. Is that really true? What does that mean? And in halacha or in Gemara in general, if you remember, there's a whole sugya about Esther. We're going to get to it in Sanhedrin, or it comes up in a few places, but they say Esther, how did she have relations with Achashverosh? And then they say she was karka olam, she was passive. And in general, they say it's possible that halachically we view the woman as passive in the relationship because it's the man who's going inside the woman. He's doing the action, the woman is just there. Okay, again, one could argue with this, but in halacha, they often view it that way. So now they say, Vihilo, what do you mean? She's also obviously an active participant. How do we know that? They don't use anything physiological to prove this, but how do they prove it? Haktiv. It says in the Torah, if a man and a woman engage in a forbidden relationship, they both get curried. So she gets punished. If she gets punished, it must be she did an action. You don't get punished for not doing an action, to which the Gemara says, no, that doesn't prove anything. There might be enjoyment for her and for him. But he's the one who did the action, and therefore, When it comes to punishment, she'll get punished because she did benefit from his action. There was pleasure. But when it comes to him injuring her, it was his action that caused it, and he's the one who's considered the one doing the action and not the woman, and that's why he's going to be liable. So again, going back, one compares it to our Mishna and said he's exempt, and the other compares it to the ir case and says if when you go into a place where you're allowed to go into, and we view it as if you went into someone else's space and damaged, then all the more so here when he actually went into her space and damaged her, he's going to be liable. And in fact, we paskin that way. So if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, in Choshe Mishpat Siman Taf Kaf Aleph, Seif Yubet, says Hamazik liishto b'tashmish hamitah hayav b'nezakeh. Shulchan Aruch paskins he is liable for the damages he causes her. And then he compares it to another case. Ha'omer lechavero ktat yadi osmat eini. You say to someone, and this is similar to the case we saw about the gacheled and about saying, rip my clothes. If you say, break my arm, okay, I say to you, go break my arm. Okay? You're even al-minacha tapatul, hareza chaya b'chamisha dvarim. You're liable for damages. Even if I say, okay, and you'll be exempt. Because hadavar yadua she'en adam rotzeh bekach. Nobody wants that. So likewise, when the woman engaged in sexual relationship with her husband, she certainly didn't want him to, she gave him permission, but not to hurt her, not to injure her. Okay, so it's a very interesting halacha. The Rama adds that if he says al minat liftor, you actually will be exempt. But then he distinguishes between a case where I would say break my arm and it's okay, I don't mind. You know, I will exempt you. Maybe then I really will be exempt. But if I say break my arm and you say, am I going to be exempt? And I said yes, then the Rama says it could mean you meant yes, like yes, what you really think so, and therefore my yes doesn't really mean yes. Anyway, this is just a very interesting sugya in general, but we're going to move on as usual because we don't have that much time. Haya bal korah rishon. So now we have this case where what they really want to focus is on the case where somebody did something strange, like stopped in the middle, right? You're normally walking, you expect, right? And the most time you really, well, first of all, nowadays people do this all the time because they're busy on their phone and all of a sudden they might just, stop while they're walking in the middle of the street. But usually it happens in a car where someone's going into a parking spot, but they don't tell you that, and they don't signal, and they don't anything, and they just stop in the middle of the street, and you weren't expecting it, and then you bump into them. So here we have someone who stops in the middle of the street, and then we say it's their fault. So now we're going to bring this halacha of Reish Lakish, because the person who stops is doing something atypical. We're now going to compare it to this case that Reish Lakish said that we already learned. You have to a little bit, maybe you forgot it anyway, but erase what we know about Reish Lakish, because this sugya is going to view it a little bit differently. And then eventually the Gemara is going to reject all our attempts here. We're going to try to prove Reish Lakish from one part of the Mishnah. Then we're going to try to prove it from a different part of the Mishnah, and both are going to be unsuccessful. Okay, so now first let's read Reish Lakish, and then we'll see what the Gemara thinks of it at first, then we'll see what the Gemara thinks of it after, and then we'll explain the Gemara sugya doesn't in the end explain Reish Lakish, but we can explain it based on the way we learned it already previously. Amar Reish Lakish, shtei parot bereshut harabim, achat revutza ve'achad ma'alecha. We have two cows in the public domain. One is crouching, which is atypical, and one is walking, which is typical. Ba'ata ma'alecha berevutza ptura. If the one who's walking kicks the one who's crouching, the one who's walking is exempt, even though normally kicking is liable. Revutza b'mahalechet chayevet. But now they want to say if the one who was crouched kicks the one who was walking, then the one who was crouched is liable. Now we're going to say lema mesayeh. Why don't we say that what can prove Reish Lakish? Our Mishnah. Haya bal korah rishon ubal chavit acharon nishbera kado b'korah patur ve'im haba bal korah chayav. Now v'hahacha dekirvutza b'mahalechet ami v'katani chayav. They're now going to compare, and this is important to get, and you can see it in the charted out what we're comparing to what. We're now going to say the case where the one we want to prove, in other words, we're going to take this case where the person who did something strange is liable, and then compare it to the other case where someone who did something strange is liable. Who did something strange? In our case, the Bala Korah stopped in the middle of the road and is now liable for their actions. The one who crouched did something atypical and is liable for their actions. So because they're liable for their actions, they crouched, which they shouldn't have done, and then they kicked, they're liable for their actions. Now, the last time we learned this we actually said was the typical case. We'll get to what we learned before, but right now they're saying, oh, atypical behavior where you see someone's liable, that must be it's the same thing. To which the Gemara is going to say, but Tizbra, do you really think so? You tried to bring a proof from here. Not only lo mistaya de lo messiah, not only is it not a proof at all, but ela mikshanami kasha, but it actually raises a difficulty with Reish Lakish. Why is that? Well, what happened here? The rivutza crouched and then kicked. Now, why is the rivutza liable here? Because they kicked, right? So, tama debata, hahus kami mela patur. What if she was just crouched on the ground and injured the other cow by, crashing into each other? Well, according to this, she's only liable because she kicked. Otherwise, it would have said just crouching. But no, the fact that she kicked is what made the owner liable. And hamat nitin to mimela katane v'chayak, right? The Mishnah was talking about a case where they just bumped into each other and they're liable. So the rivutza is only liable if she kicked, but the bala korah is liable if they just stopped and bumped into each other, which means there was no action taken on the part. This is similar to the previous where we said, there was an action taken by the man, whereas there was no action taken by the two people who crashed into each other. So same thing here, in which case it's not comparable at all. And not only that, but right now we have a problem with Reish Lakish from our Mishna. So we're going to have to resolve the problem, and then we'll go back to seeing if we can make some other comparison. So they say, matnitin, you would have to explain in order to resolve Reish Lakish that the Mishnah was talking about the paschal orche kishilda. We had this yesterday, that the beam was going widthwise across the whole public domain like a shela, like a skeleton. Okay, like a skeleton lies. So the beam was widthwise covering the whole space, which meant that the person who was carrying the chavit had nowhere else to go but to bump into the balakoa because there was no space on the sides for them to pass. But hacha, in the animal that's crouched on the ground, this is just typical. If the animal's crouched, they're not going to be crouched and blocking the entire way. So kigon de Rava b'chagisa. Now, what do we want to know? We want to know the rivutza is liable because she kicked. However, if the inference is if she didn't kick, but the other animal just bumped into her and got hurt by bumping into, the owner of the animal would not be liable. Now, why is that? Because the animal was crouched in one spot on one side. It was the other cow's fault for not going around. See something on the floor, go around. Okay, and that's why the rivutza wouldn't be liable if she hadn't kicked. Okay, so basically what we did was we tried to prove Reish Lakish from the Mishnah, which wasn't really a great thought anyway. And then they say, forget about the fact that this isn't even a proof at all because they didn't really understand the proof. In addition, our Mishnah actually raises a difficulty with it because of an inference from our Mishnah. Okay, from the fact that to the rivutza is only liable if she kicked and not if they just bumped into each other. So you'd have to explain the Mishnah is where there was no other path. Right? We always thought the korah, the way I always imagined it was the korah was facing forward, and that's why we assumed the barrel got knocked by the tip of the beam. Now we're learning, according to, again, only to resolve Reish Lakish, all of a sudden we're saying the beam went widthwise across and there was no other way for the Bala Chavit to go. But they now suggest maybe you were just a little confused. But maybe you can use the latter part of our Mishnah to prove Reish Lakish, which is what? If the person carrying the barrel was first, and the beam was in the back, okay, fine. But but if the Baal Chavit stops short, that's going to exempt the other person. Now, why is this going to be a proof? This is going to be a proof for the opposite case in Reish Lakish. We're going to find the case that's exempt. In our case, the person holding the barrel is exempt because they did something. The person holding the barrel is not going to be able to demand damages. Why? Because they did something different. They stopped in the middle of the street, which was unexpected. And therefore, they can't claim damages. In the case of the mahalechet, who kicked the rivutza, there was an animal crouched on the ground, and the mahalechet, the one who was walking, kicked the rivutza, they're also going to be not liable. Why? Because what was the rivutza doing on the floor, crouched on the floor? That's not typical behavior. So we have atypical behavior of the Bala Chavit, atypical behavior of the animal that's crouching, and in both cases, the other one that causes them damage is exempt. So that sounds like a good comparison. However, it's not really a good comparison because think about it. In the case of the Mishnah, what happened? The barrel person stopped. The other person bumps into them. Okay. But that's not the same as the mehalechet who kicks the revutza. It's not that the mehalechet bumped into the revutza. They kicked the revutza. So the owner of the cow who was crouching could say, listen, I understand my animal crouched in the middle of the street. So I get it if your animal climbed on top of me to get over, climbed on top of my animal to get to where they wanted to get to. But to kick my animal, you definitely did not have permission to do that. That's going a step farther. So you wouldn't necessarily be able to learn Reish Lakish from our Mishnah, because if you tried to derive it from our Mishnah, you'd say our Mishnah is where they just bumped in. But if there was an action taken beyond the norm, the expected norm, then we would actually make the owner, right? Then we would make the owner liable. And that's not what Reish Lakish says. So basically, we can't prove Reish Lakish from our Mishnah. Now, in the end, if you remember, what was the reason? The reason was it was all because if you change something, right, then the animal's behavior, and then by the way, it all has to do with animals and not humans, so you can't even compare the cases. Once you change something, then we expect the animal to respond to that, right? The kicking of the animal who was walking was kicking because he was set off by the animal that was crouching and doing something odd. And this happens with people with, right, little kids. I mentioned this before when we learned it last time, but it happens where if the mood in the house is tense, little kids will go crazy and they'll go hitting. And, we all know that they're affected by the moods of, atypical behavior in the house. Hopefully bad moods are right, or screaming and things like that, or atypical behavior in the house will cause little kids, which are, again, I'm not saying little kids are like animals, but again, it's more of like an instinctual response. Things are out of whack. It causes people to react in ways that are more violent. So it does cause that kind of thing. And if you have animals, you can see the same thing, right? Dogs will get worked up when someone's worked up near them, or something is atypical, or something is out of whack. Right? They start barking because dogs, they see something, makes them a little crazy. So this is actually makes a lot of sense. And then it has absolutely nothing to do with what they were trying to compare it to our Mishnah. Okay, new Mishnah. Okay, by the way, there's two ways to read this Mishnah. Either this is the topic sentence, two people are on the road, and now we're going to see in what formation. One is running and one is walking. Or you could read it and now we're going to see, or Oshayu Shnehem Ratzim. So either there's two cases, one running, one walking, or both running, and the first is just a topic sentence. Two people are on the road, it's walking, one is running. Or it could be two people are walking, or one is walking, one is running, or both are running. So it could be three cases. It's not a huge difference either which way, but that's two different ways to read the Mishnah. And they damaged each other because either the two people walking bumped into each other, the one running and the one walking bumped into each other, the two people running bumped into each other, caused each other damage. Okay, by the way, hiziku sounds like they did some action to cause each other danger, but most commentaries say no. Obviously, they bumped into each other. It wasn't active action. Shnehem ptulim, very interesting, especially which is the most interesting, right? If both are walking or both are running, we get they're exempt because no one's more responsible than the other. But one running and one walking, you would say running is atypical, right? Nowadays, you might say running is very typical. People are running all the time. But in those days, it was not common to run. And running was definitely an atypical behavior. Even nowadays, one could claim. Depends maybe where you live. Anyway, shnehem ptulim, and yet they're both exempt. So now the Gemara is going to immediately say, by the way, this is not agreed upon by everybody. Matnitin to Loki Isi ben Yehuda. Isi ben Yehuda does not agree with our Mishnah. Titanya, Isi ben Yehuda Omer, here's a braita, and he's a Tana. He said, Ratz chayav mipdeshu mishuneh. The one who's running is liable because they're doing, if one is running and one is walking, the one who ran bumped into the one who, right? If they bumped into each other, it's obviously the person who's running who's responsible because he's doing atypical behavior. However, he says on Friday afternoon, when it's right before Shabbat, you're allowed to be running, okay? Because you want to go, right? We're going to see why, okay? But let's just start now. Sounds like the mitzvah of Ner Hanukkah, right? Same thing. You're not liable for the damage your candle causes, as we saw the other day, because of this. So now they say, right? Because he had permission. So first, before we get to that whole thing about Ben Hashmasho, now we're going to see that Rabbi Yochanan. So right now we think our Mishnah doesn't hold like Isi ben Yehuda. The problem is that comes Rabbi Yochanan and he says, "I'm Rabbi Yochanan halachaki Isi ben Yehuda. We pass him like Isi ben Yehuda." So why is that such a problem? Well, we have a principle that what? We saw this not so long ago. Umi amar Rabbi Yochanan hachi, and it's all over Shas, this line. Ha'amar Rabbi Yochanan halakha kestam Mishna. Rabbi Yochanan paskins like a Mishnah where there's no machloket in it. Stam Mishnah is a Mishnah without a name of a rabbi and without a machloket. And he paskins, and he's Stam Mishnah, he paskins that way. If he paskins like that, it's none. It says in our Mishnah. So how can you possibly say that he holds like Yosi ben Yehuda and he holds like a Stam Mishnah, because our Mishnah says the opposite? So to which the Gemara answers, maybe we misunderstood our Mishnah. Maybe our Mishnah is only talking about Friday afternoon just before Shabbat. Mimai. Now, how could you possibly get this? Well, here's their proof. You don't need the line or both were running. If you say if one was running and one was walking, he's exempt, then both are exempt, and you don't need a line that says or both were running, they're exempt, because if one running and one walking and no one's liable, obviously you wouldn't even need to say if they're both running. Therefore, it must be that we're missing words here in the Mishnah, because otherwise that second case is totally unnecessary. This must be the way to read it. One running, one walking is exempt. In which case are they exempt? When it's Friday afternoon before Shabbat. But on a weekday, and then the Mishnah matches Yosi ben Yehuda, because we've now said that he's distinguishing. Now, why does Shnehem Ratzim need to be there? Because Shnehem Ratzim, if they're both running, afilu b'chol p'turin, even on a weekday, they both be exempt. And that's a different case, and that's why you'd have to mention it, because there's a distinction. One is only for erev Shabbat ben Mashot, and the other is on a chol. Obviously, hard to read that into the Mishnah. If that's what the Mishnah wanted to say, it should have said it. But sometimes we know that when things were passed down, they were passed down incomplete, and perhaps that's a way to read the Mishnah. Amar Mar. Now we're just going to focus on this one line of the braita. Umoda, we quoted about Yosi ben Yehuda. Umoda isi be'erev Shabbat ben Mashot shu patur mipnei sheratz bereshut. So now they want to know be'erev Shabbat my bereshurika. What's this permission you have, right? It's not like the mitzvah of Ner Hanukkah that it's a clear mitzvah. You're supposed to light your candles. What's the mitzvah to run on erev Shabbat? Who says there's a mitzvah to run on erev Shabbat? Well, they say kid Rabbi Chanina, the Amar Rabbi Chanina, moving now to Amabet, Bo v'neitzei likrat kala malkata. So we should go and run and greet the Shabbat queen. The Amrela, some people say likrat Shabbat kala malkata. Sorry, I didn't say right. The bride queen. Some people say Shabbat the bride queen. Not clear what exactly the difference is. Rabbi Yana mitatef v'kai, he would wrap himself and go out, stand up and say Amar boi kala boi kala. One is we should go greet the queen. This one is saying boi kala boi kala. You obviously know that that's from Kabbalat Shabbat, was taken from here. When the Kabbalists came up with the prayers of Kabbalat Shabbat, which were developed much, much later, they use the language here, boi kala for our tefillot. Okay, it comes from our sukkah. So that's why on Shabbat, it's a whole different story. Moving now to the next Mishnah. Okay, let's go through all the cases. I just wanted you to see that it's set up a little like the last one. This one, that one, that, switch each a parameter, and let's explain. So now, and obviously the Gemara is going to say, why do we need each of these? So if you're chopping trees in the public domain, and some of the things you're chopping go flying and damage into a private domain, or you're and that's in someone else's private domain. Here they use reshut yachid to mean private domain, but sometimes it's yours, sometimes it's someone else's. Kind of goes back and forth. What if you're reshut yachid, you're in your own domain, and you're chopping, you're cutting trees in your backyard, and flies out into the public domain and injures someone? Or you're standing in your own reshut yachid, and it goes into your neighbor's yard, reshut yachid acher, and it damages somebody there. All those cases you're going to be liable. To which the Gemara says, Srich, why did you need all three cases? And now I charted out what's unique about each case. If you were chopping in the private domain and it injured, though it went flying into the public domain, you would say you should have been careful because you know that it could fly out there and there's a lot of people and the chances of it hitting someone are pretty high. But if you're chopping in the Reshut HaRabim and it goes into someone's private domain, you might say, what were the chances are that the person in that private domain was going to be walking by at that exact moment it was such a small chance that maybe I'm not liable for what I did, because what were the chances are that was going to happen? And therefore, they need to tell you, no, you're liable in any case. The itaname Rishud Rabim leRishud Yachid. What's the chidush of that? Well, Rishud Rabim, if I'm standing in public domain and it flies into the private domain, you would say, Mishum demiikara shelo b'Rishud Abi. What was I doing chopping trees in the public domain? I don't have permission to chop trees in the public domain. But if I'm chopping in my own garden and it happens to fly into the public domain, maybe I wouldn't be responsible because I'm allowed to chop trees in my garden. Maybe I don't have to worry about damage it's going to cause if it flies into the public domain. Therefore, they need to teach you that case as well. You are still liable. What if you have both those cases and then you didn't have the last one, which is from my own private domain to your garden, right? Your private domain. So, right? You would say each of those cases had, right? One is because you were in your own domain, but you threw it, you let it go into a place where there were a lot of people and high chance of damage. And in the case where you were in the public domain and it went to a private domain, it was because you weren't allowed to be chopping trees in the first place. But if I'm in my own garden and it goes into my neighbor's garden and damages, number one, there weren't a lot of people there, chances were very slim. And I have permission to chop in my own garden. You might have thought maybe I'm not liable. And that's why you needed all three cases. Now what we're going to do from today and continue into tomorrow, and I even filled in the chart through tomorrow because it's a chart that's going to kind of have a third element. We're going to learn the first two elements of the sugya, and then the third element is going to connect. I didn't want to give you an incomplete chart, so we'll refer back to it tomorrow. We're going to start with a braita, and then we're going to have something Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Chanina said about this braita. Or at least today we're going to think he said it about the braita, but there's going to be a debate about which part of the braita he said it. Okay, and then, so we're going to have two ways of reading it. Each time we're going to ask some questions about it, and this is where we're going to get much more into the issue of Ir Miklat, of the refuge city. Tomorrow, we're going to see that there's a third opinion about what Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Chanina said. His statement about it actually didn't have to do with this braita. Okay, so that's the, it did have to do with Ir Miklat, refuge city, but on a different source. But that's for tomorrow. So let's start with our braita. You have a workshop, okay, a woodworking workshop, and you're cutting wood there. And I walk in without permission, okay? It happens to be a workshop, not in a sense it's a shop. It's where you're working, and it's not open to the public. And I happen to go in there. And because we're talking about accidental murder, what happens here? Okay, you're chopping your stuff. It flies onto me and kills me. Now, it seems like you knew I was in there, but you didn't give me permission to go in there. So, patur, you're exempt. Right now, we assume patur means you're exempt from murder, from going to a refuge city, because I came into your property. It's almost like we talked about the damages, right? If I come into your property and damage your property, what are we doing there? Okay, like you say, what were you doing coming in here? I wasn't allowed to come in, so what was I doing there? If I get killed, you don't have to go to a refuge city. Now, im nichnas bereshut chayav. But if I went in with permission, it was an open store, anyone can come in, and I went in with permission, or you told me, I knocked on the door, you said, come in, you continued working, I got killed, then you would have to go to the refuge city. So now they want to know, okay, right now, I just assumed, okay, patur and chayav means refuge city. Why did I assume that? Because it says vamet, okay, so it seemed reasonable, I would say that. But now, we're going to have the first reading of Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Chanina. My chayav. Chayav doesn't mean what we thought it meant, that you go to the refuge city. Amar Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Chanina, chayav ba'arba'a dvarim upatur migalut. You're liable if you cause me damage. If I went into your store with permission, and yet you still damaged me, so you're going to have to pay damages, because we already learned. Bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezi, it doesn't matter. You're liable for damages. But you're going to be exempt from galut. You're not, galut is another word. It really means exile, but what it really means is refuge city. Okay? That's what we're going to see when we get to Makot. There's a whole chapter, Elohena Golim. These are the people that go to Ir Miklat. That's where it all comes up. Galut is refuge city, which it's interesting they call it that, because galut sounds like a punishment, and we already said that it has both elements to it. It's a punishment, but it also helps you, well, like any punishment atones, But in addition, it provides you with protection from the relatives. If you don't get the protection from the relatives can kill you and they won't be liable. Again, depending on if you're karov lemezid, you're more closer to intentional murder, or where are you on the scale? Are you closer to ones, where you don't even need to go to ir miklat. And then, by the way, if the relatives kill you, they're responsible, right? They'll get killed for killing you. Anyway, we now change chayav. According to this, chayav doesn't mean you have to go to an ir miklat. You don't have to go to an ir miklat. You're actually exempt from ir miklat. So now, why is this? Why are you exempt from going to the refuge city? They're not really dealing with the four things, although it's pretty obvious. You're obligated because you're obligated. You damage no matter what, you're liable. You're just not liable for boshet. Remember the fifth, because boshet is only when you actually intend. You didn't intend here. Now we're going to review. What makes a ya'ar, right? That was the case, the classic case of ir miklat in the Torah. Right? Each one went into a place where they were permitted, and it was a public space. Here, but this person went into someone else's domain, and if that person kills there, they're going to be exempt from the refuge city. Now, what do we call this? Where is it on the scale? We assume, right? It's on the scale of, sounds like, because he went into his friend's domain, it's on the scale of ones, right? Like karov la'ones. But we're going to see in a minute that if I think about the case, you let me into your store and you knew I was there, and then you continued to do your work even though you knew I was right there, as opposed to in a yar where you don't even know, you should actually be more responsible. Okay, but for right now, they think you're less responsible because he came into your reshut, basically. Okay, he came in, right? I went into your domain. You accidentally killed me, but it was my fault for going into your domain. So I'm a Rava kavachomet. Rava says that's totally, there's no sense in that. My ya'al shezelidato nichnas v'zelidato nichnas. In a ya'ar, each can go in, right, of their own volition. And yet, na'asa kemisha nichnas l'dat chavero v'golet. But what do we say? It's as if you went into someone else's domain. This is what we said at the beginning of class. It's as if you went into someone else's domain, and therefore you go to exile, because what were you doing? Going into their, right, domain and killing someone. So now, if you went into someone's domain and they killed you, and it was their domain, all the more so, you should have to go to the ir miklat. To which Ela Marava my patur migalut dilo sagele begalut. And this is, like I said, a very big issue in ir miklat. It's that you can't even get the reward of going to ir miklat. Ir miklat is something good to a certain extent, right? It gives you a way to atone for your sins. Right? Think about the person who killed this man 2 days ago. You know, what's his life like? It's going to be miserable to think all his life he killed someone accidentally. The Torah provides you with a refuge city, a way to atone, a way to deal with your problems. This guy is so karov lemezid, doesn't get a chance to do that. Okay, because because you let the person into your store and then you continued working as if you didn't care if you hurt them. So you're much more karov lemezid, and that's why you don't go to galut. And then it all fits in. Okay, and then it's very basic. And anyone who knows anything about ir miklat, this is a very basic standard rule. Shogeg is the middle. Anything. And this is obviously what we just said. It's different from damages. Damages, it doesn't matter where you are on the scale. Shogeg, you're going to be liable for the four things, right? For all those nezek, tzar, ripoy, shevet. Not boshet, because you need intent, but you will be liable for all those things. Bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, and there we mean, right, bein b'ones, bein b'ratzon, anywhere you are on the scale. Again, maybe not ones all the way, but yes, you have a much wider range. But when it comes to ir miklat, it's really just that middle and around the middle, but not to either side. But why I wanted to set it up is this is a very obvious fact. The Gemara is not going to be so clear on that. The Gemara is going to suggest two cases where we see, really, shogeg karov lemezid is exempt from ir miklat. You don't get to go. So now they're going to shogeg karov lemezid. So mativra. Hosiflo, we're not going to have two Tanaitic sources. It seem to go against this principle that if you're karov lemezid, then you don't go to ir miklat. Hosiflo ritzuah chatame. If you're the shaliach beit din who's giving lashes, you're administering lashes to someone, and you give one too many. They usually assess how many this person can handle, or you go with the basic number 39 if you're a very healthy person, and he went with 40. Hareze golel yado. The shliach beit din actually ends up in the ir miklat. because if they kill you, they did one too many, kill the person, they go to the ir mikla. Now this is shogeg karov lemezid. Why? Everybody knows that one too many lashes can actually kill a person. And yet, this person wasn't careful. They gave one too many, and yet they go to ir mikla. That should be in shogeg karov lemezid. He miscounted. And that was a mistake. He just miscounted. He didn't mean to give him one too many. That's why he goes to ir mikla. Well, Rava didn't like this answer so much so that Tafachle Rava b'sandale, he hits him with his sandal. Okay, he takes the sandal and says, "What, you idiot? Amale, atahu mane, what, you think he counts? Of course, he's not the one who counts. V'hatanya, gadol shebedayanim kore. The head, the biggest of the dayanim, he's the one who calls out the numbers. Hasheni moneh, the second guy keeps count. Hashlishi omer hikau, the third guy says hit him. And right, it's almost like when we have the Baal Tokea, and in Shul on Rosh Hashanah, and there's someone stands there telling him he's not supposed to count himself. Someone else counts. He just blows the shofar. This guy is hitting, just does what he's told. He's he's just supposed to listen. If they messed up in the numbers, it wasn't him who messed up, so he shouldn't go to ir mikla for that. So Elam, Rav Shimon ben Nahardea, Dita Dayan Gufe. The Dayan made a mistake in the counting. Okay, well, that's unfair. So now the Shliach Beitin has to, yes, there was a mistake in the counting. I didn't mean the person himself. I meant the Dayan. But what? Shliach Beitin is going to be, now we're going to put him exactly in the middle of Shkaga. Why? Because he should have also been doing his own count and made sure, and he did it. Now, it's not karov lemezid because he was following what someone else was saying, but you should never follow anyone blindly, and you should always take into account your own considerations, and therefore, therefore, you're doing something dangerous, which could kill someone. So keep your own count in your head, and that puts him in the shogeg in the middle case. Okay, second question on this shogeg karov lemezid doesn't go to ir mikla. How many times do you tell your kids don't throw stones? Right? It's very dangerous. So someone throws a stone into the public domain and kills, he goes to the ir mikla. Now again, isn't this shogeg karov lemezid? You should have known. Maybe someone will walk by in the public domain. What were you doing throwing there? And yet you go to ir mikla. You were just knocking down your wall, and the stone went and killed someone. Okay, that doesn't help. You should still pay attention when you break down your wall. Make sure there's nobody there. You did it at night. Okay, that doesn't really help. You still need to look at nighttime. Well, you were doing it during the day into the garbage dump, and therefore you didn't expect anyone to be there. So now they say, what kind of garbage are we talking about? If it's a garbage dump that a lot of people go into, we'll see soon why people go into garbage dumps. You might be surprised by the answer. But if there's a lot of people going in there during the day, then you're mazid, then that's intentional. If nobody goes there during the day, then you're anus. Then you should, that's either which way you shouldn't go to ir mikla, because you're either more intentional about it, or really it wasn't your fault at all. But what was that person doing? So Amar Papa lo tzrich ela ba'ashpa asuya lipanot balayla ve'en asuya lipanot bayom. This is a garbage dump that people use to go to the bathroom in. So, but generally they don't use it during the day because people can see them. It's public. But at nighttime when it's dark, people use it. But once in a while, somebody will be there during the day. This sounds like the Katan Chavit, right? Usually this, usually that, but once in a while. So you're not considered close to intentional because really people don't use it as a bathroom during the day. But but you're also not karov la'ones because there are sometimes people who go sit there during the day and do their thing there. So therefore we got to this middle case, if that's right, and that's the case where the person who throws a rock, we've now taken it out of context, the person who throws a rock, but really what they were doing was they were taking down their wall in the middle of the public into a garbage dump during the day when it was very unexpected that someone would be there, but there was a bit of a chance, and therefore you go to ir mikla. So both those didn't really knock down our answer. That again, we explained Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Chanina was talking about the seifa part, about the part if you had permission to go into the store, the person is chayav. Chayav meant liable for damages, but not to ir mikla because it's shogeg karov lemezid. Now we bring the second explanation. Rav Papa Mishmei Rava Matni La Reisha. He said this statement of Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Chanina, the same statement, Chayav, but the four things for damages, but exempt from ir miklat was actually on the reisha. You went in shelo bereshut. This actually works better with the pshat. If you died, the person is exempt. Why are they exempt? Because what were you doing going into their store? They're so karov la'ones that they're exempt. And then Amar Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Chanina, what does it mean exempt? Chayav b'arba dvarim. Okay, what they didn't tell you is you still are liable for the 4 things, because even though you didn't expect them to be there still, and they weren't allowed to be there, but you did damage them, so you have to pay for that. But patur migalut, but you're exempt from going to your miklat, and that's how we understood the source to begin with. We just didn't think it had anything to do with damages, and he's just adding, you're also liable for damages if you just damaged them and didn't kill them. So now they say, man dematnei seifa kol sheken hareisha. If you learned this on the seifa, that in the first way we read it, that you're going to be exempt from ir miklat there, for sure you're going to be exempt from ir miklat here, because you're so much more so karov la'ones. But if you said it on the reisha, you said it here, you're exempt from ir miklat, the assumption would be in the previous case, you'd actually have to go to ir miklat, okay? Because you let the person in, you knew they were there, it is shogeg, and you would have to say it's kind of in the middle, okay? Here they seem to ignore that there's 2 different things going on here. They seem to say it's a range. If you're patur here, you'll be chayav there. Or if you're patur there, you'll be patur there also. Okay, and it's a range, and it's not that it shifts, right? It goes up. You're from no, you're not. Yes, you are. No, you can't. Okay, they think no just means no in general, or yes means yes in general. It's a little bit of a hard sugya to understand in terms of that. But anyway, they now say, Umi chayav galut. Are you really chayav galut? But this goes against, if you say it's about the reisha, someone who comes in unexpected, unannounced, you have to go to ir miklat, but it says in a braita, okay, a glass blower, and sparks come out and injure the guy on the face, patul, you're exempt from ir miklat. Even if he came with permission. And what did we just say? If you say he's patur here, you might say he's chayav in the case where he comes in with permission. Now, if he comes in with permission, it says here you're exempt, and we just said you're liable. So it's talking about his apprentice. So again, we're going to say, what does that help? Okay, so if it's your apprentice, then you're liable to go to your miklat. So they say the case where we say you're exempt. If someone random comes in bereshut, you have to go to your miklat. But if it was your apprentice, then you don't have to. So they say, why? Because he's supposed to die, this guy, and that's why you don't go to your miklat. It doesn't make any sense. The case was, we had something similar the other day, where you're pushing him out the door and he doesn't leave. You say, please leave, and the guy doesn't leave. So they say, still, because the guy doesn't listen to you, so now you can kill him and not have to go to your miklat? That sounds crazy. No, what happened was you said, please leave, and you assumed the guy listened to you and left, and then you continued your work, didn't realize he was still in the room. So they say, okay, well, then that would be true for anybody. It should be true for anybody. To which the answer, somebody else won't be scared of their master because it's not their master. So if you say to some random person who comes into your store, please leave, you don't assume they're going to leave. But if you say to your apprentice, please leave, you assume they listen to you and they're going to leave. And the fact that he didn't, well, then you're going to be exempt from ir miklat if they end up getting killed. So quick review of today, because I know it's late and it's a long daf, but let's try to review very quickly. So we started with this, Zebaba Chavito, Zebaba Korato. We had all the different scenarios. We tried to learn from there about a husband who injures his wife while having sexual relations. Is he liable or not? We tried to compare it to there. We tried to compare it to an ir miklat case. Then we went to the next case about Reish Lakish, the 2 parot, and then we tried to say, can we learn that from our Mishna about shinoi, about someone who changes? We tried 2 comparisons, it didn't work. We then talked about the running and the walking, and that also, right, we had 2 different interpretations. Either it is Isi ben Yehuda or it's not Isi ben Yehuda, and really maybe one who is running is liable, only just not if they're permitted to run, like on erev Shabbat be'enesh mashot. Then we got to the chopping tree case. We talked about the uniqueness of all the 3 cases, of public to private, private to public, and private to private. Then we brought in this braita, and then we have Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Chanina, who said you have to pay damages, but you're patur from galut. We had 2 different interpretations, and then we got to, Are you patur from galus because you're karov to mazid, or are you patur from galus because you're karov laonis? And there were different interpretations of what we were talking about. And then if you say it on one, what does it mean for the other? And then we had some questions on it. With that, a quick review, and we're finished for today. Wishing everybody a great day and hoping for good news. Not so easy these days.